They said the horse wasn't worth the dust beneath its hooves, but they never noticed where it kept looking. The wind moved slow across the Texas plain that evening, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and old wood, brushing against the edges of a town that had long since learned how to laugh at anything that didn't belong. At the center of it all stood Charles Whitmore, his polished boots untouched by dirt, his smile sharp beneath the brim of a hat that cost more than most men's monthly wages, and beside him, tethered loosely as if it barely mattered, was the horse no one wanted. Its coat was dull, the color of faded earth after too many summers without rain, its ribs faintly visible beneath skin that seemed stretched thin by time and neglect, and one hind leg bore a stiffness that made each step uncertain, like it had forgotten what it meant to trust the ground. The crowd had already decided its fate before it even moved. Laughter came easy here. It rolled through the open air, bounced off the wooden rails, settled into the dust like something permanent. And then there was Ethan Cole, standing just outside the circle, quiet as the wind before a storm, his shirt worn thin at the elbows, his hands rough from years of work that never seemed to lead anywhere, his eyes steady in a way that made people uncomfortable because they couldn't quite read what was behind them. He hadn't come looking for trouble, and he certainly hadn't come expecting to be seen, but in towns like this, the poor didn't get the luxury of invisibility for long. Whitmore turned just enough to let the moment breathe, to let the eyes settle, to make sure everyone was watching when he made his move, and with a casual flick of his wrist, he gestured toward the horse like it was nothing more than an afterthought. "Seems you've been wanting a shot, Cole," he said, his voice carrying easily, smooth and practiced, the kind of voice that never had to ask twice. "Figured I'd help you out." The rope was passed forward, not with care, but with a kind of careless amusement that made the gesture feel heavier than it was, and the horse didn't resist, didn't shy away, didn't even flinch the way a broken thing usually does when it expects more of the same. Instead, it lifted its head just slightly, ears turning, eyes scanning, not the crowd, not the man who owned it, but something else, something far beyond the wooden fences and the noise and the weight of judgment pressing in from every side. Ethan didn't move right away. The laughter reached him, sharp and easy, words slipping through the air like loose gravel. "That thing won't last a week. He's finally lost it. Guess some folks don't know when to quit." But he didn't answer. He stepped forward slowly, boots pressing into the dirt with a quiet certainty that didn't belong in a moment like this, and when his hand reached for the rope, it paused just long enough to feel the breath of the animal on the other end, warm and unsteady, but not afraid. For a second, just a second, the world seemed to narrow, the noise dulling into something distant, and in the horse's eyes, Ethan saw something no one else had bothered to look for. Not weakness. Not defeat. Something waiting. Something unfinished. The rope tightened gently in his hand, and the horse followed without resistance, each step uneven but deliberate, like it had already chosen him long before this moment ever arrived. Behind them, the laughter rose again, louder now, chasing them toward the edge of town, but it didn't follow all the way. Because as the sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the dry land, the horse slowed near the gate, lifted its head once more, and turned, not toward the road home, but toward the distant line of hills barely visible against the fading light, standing there in stillness as if listening to something no one else could hear. The gate creaked once as Ethan pushed it open, the sound thin and hollow against the wide stretch of land that waited beyond, and for a moment he thought the horse might hesitate, might pull back or falter under the weight of its own weakness, but it did not. It stood there with that same quiet stillness, head slightly raised, eyes fixed on the distant hills as if the rest of the world had already faded away, and Ethan followed its gaze without fully understanding why, seeing nothing more than a faint blue line where earth met sky, a place no one in town ever talked about because there was nothing out there worth the trouble, just rock, dry grass, and stories that never led anywhere, yet something in the way the horse breathed, slow and measured despite the uneven rise of its ribs, made him pause before stepping forward, as if he had walked into a moment that did not belong to him alone, and when he finally moved, the rope stayed loose in his hand because the animal did not need pulling, it chose to walk beside him, each step careful but certain, leaving the noise of town behind until the laughter turned into memory and then into nothing at all, replaced by the steady rhythm of hooves on dry ground and the low whisper of wind slipping through fence posts that had not been painted in years, and by the time they reached the edge of Ethan's property, the sun had dipped low enough to paint everything in shades of copper and shadow, the kind of light that made even worn-out places look Like they were holding onto something worth keeping. His ranch sat quiet, a few acres of land that had seen better seasons, the barn leaning just enough to tell the truth about time, the fence lines uneven where repairs had been made with whatever could be found, and the house itself small and steady, built more for survival than comfort. And still the horse slowed again before entering, not out of fear but out of attention, ears flicking toward the horizon, nostrils catching the air as if searching for something just beyond reach. Ethan noticed it then, the way the animal listened more than it reacted, the way it seemed to measure the world instead of shrinking from it, and it unsettled him in a way he could not name, because broken things usually carried a kind of quiet surrender, but this one carried something else, something waiting. He tied the rope loosely to the old post near the barn, expecting the horse to lower its head, to rest, to give in to the long day, but instead it remained standing, body still, eyes turned once again toward those distant hills now fading into dusk, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the air cooling, the first hints of night settling in. Until Ethan finally stepped closer, raising a hand slowly, not out of habit but out of something deeper, and when his fingers brushed the horse's neck, the skin trembled beneath his touch, not from fear but from recognition, like a memory passing through muscle and bone. He exhaled quietly, the sound barely more than the wind itself, and leaned his forehead lightly against the animal's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breath. And for the first time in a long while, the silence around him did not feel empty. Behind them the land stretched wide and quiet, but far off in the distance, just before the last light disappeared, the horse lifted its head once more, sharper this time, ears forward, body alert in a way that did not match its condition, and if Ethan had been looking closely enough, he might have noticed that whatever the horse was waiting for had just begun to move. The night settled slowly over the ranch, not with silence but with a kind of breathing that came from the land itself, the soft rustle of dry grass, the faint creak of old wood adjusting to the cool, and somewhere in the distance, a low wind that carried more than just air across the open miles. Ethan lit the lantern by the barn door, its glow weak but steady, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like quiet reminders of everything that had been left unfinished. He brought a bucket of water, filling it halfway from the old pump that groaned with each pull, and set it near the post where the horse stood, expecting it to lower its head and drink, but again the animal did not move the way it should. It turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the offering, then lifted its gaze back toward the darkened hills, ears forward, body still, as if something out there held more weight than thirst. Ethan frowned, not in frustration but in quiet confusion. He had seen injured animals before, seen how they guarded their energy, how they chose rest over everything else, but this one seemed to be choosing something unseen, something that pulled at it stronger than instinct. He stepped closer, running his hand gently along its neck, feeling the warmth beneath the rough coat, the steady rhythm of life that had not given up, and beneath his fingers, he noticed something else, a faint ridge beneath the hair, not a fresh wound but an old mark, worn smooth by time. His brow tightened as he leaned in, lifting the lantern slightly to catch the light across the horse's shoulder, and there it was, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, a faded brand, the edges blurred but still carrying shape, not the kind used by small ranchers in town, not something casual or recent. This had been burned in long ago, carefully, deliberately, the kind of mark that meant ownership, history, value. Ethan stepped back a little, studying it now with more attention. The horse shifted once, not away from him but as if aware of what he had just seen, its head lowering slightly for the first time since they arrived, but not to drink, only to breathe deeper, its chest rising and falling with a slow, steady strength that did not match the way it looked. And then the wind changed, subtle at first, a shift in direction that carried a different scent, cooler, sharper, and the horse reacted instantly, its ears snapping forward, body tightening just enough to signal alertness. Ethan turned his head, trying to catch it too, but to him it was just night air, just another change in the weather. Yet the animal stood as if it had heard a voice carried on that wind, something distant but clear, something calling without sound. He felt it then, not hearing it, not seeing it, but sensing the way the moment deepened around them, like the land itself was holding its breath. And before he could make sense of it, the horse took a step forward, rope pulling taut against the post, not in panic, not in struggle, but in quiet insistence. It leaned into that direction, toward the hills that had already begun to disappear into darkness, and Ethan's hand tightened around the rope without thinking, his instinct telling him to hold, to keep things where they belonged, but something in his chest hesitated, because for the first time since he had taken hold of that rope, it no longer felt like he was leading the horse, it felt like he was standing in the way of where it needed to go. The rope pulled tighter against the post, the fibers stretching with a low strain that echoed faintly in the quiet of the night, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer than he should have, his hand wrapped around it, feeling the tension not just in the line but in the space between what made sense and what did not, because horses did not act like this, not broken ones, not animals that had been cast aside and left to fade into nothing. Yet this one stood with a quiet insistence that did not belong to weakness. It leaned forward again, not jerking, not fighting, just steady, patient, as if it understood that whatever lay ahead would not come to it, it had to be reached, and something in that calm persistence unsettled Ethan more than any sudden movement ever could. He exhaled slowly, the air cool against his lungs, and without fully deciding, his grip loosened just enough for the rope to slip through his fingers. The tension eased. Not released entirely, but allowed to breathe, and the horse responded instantly, not with urgency but with purpose, taking one careful step forward, then another, each movement still marked by that uneven rhythm, yet guided by something deeper than strength. Ethan followed without thinking, lantern in one hand, rope in the other, the light swinging slightly with each step, casting shifting shadows across the ground as they moved past the edge of the barn and into the open stretch of land that lay beyond his fence. The gate remained behind them. Half open, forgotten, as if the boundary it once marked no longer held any meaning. The land ahead was quiet, untouched by anything except wind and time, and the further they walked, the more the world seemed to narrow into just two sounds, the soft crunch of dry earth beneath boots and hooves, and the steady breath of the animal beside him. The town was gone now, its noise, its laughter, its certainty, all left behind in a place that felt smaller with every step, and ahead, the hills grew darker against the night sky, their shapes becoming more defined as the moon rose slowly above them, pale and distant, offering just enough light to turn shadows into something almost real. The horse slowed as they reached the first stretch of uneven ground, its head lifting slightly higher, ears fixed forward, and Ethan noticed the change immediately. The hesitation was not fear, it was awareness, the kind that came before something important revealed itself. He raised the lantern, letting the light stretch further across the path, and for a moment there was nothing, just rock, scattered brush, and the faint outline of old terrain that had long been forgotten. But then the wind shifted again, carrying with it a sound so soft it could have been imagined, a faint metallic echo, distant and irregular, like something touching against something else far away. The horse reacted before Ethan could process it, its body tightening, not in panic but in recognition, and it moved forward with more certainty than before, pulling the rope gently but firmly, guiding rather than forcing, and Ethan followed, his steps slower now, his senses sharpened by the feeling that they were no longer just walking through empty land. They were approaching something, and as the ground dipped slightly ahead, revealing a narrow path that curved between two low ridges, he felt it settle in his chest, quiet but undeniable, the realization that whatever this horse had been waiting for, whatever had been calling it from the moment he first saw it standing under that fading light, was not behind them in the town that had laughed, but somewhere out here, hidden beyond sight, waiting in the dark like a truth that had not yet been uncovered. The path narrowed as they moved between the low ridges, the ground shifting from loose dust to packed earth that carried the faint imprint of something older, something that had not been shaped by wind alone. Ethan lifted the lantern higher, its glow brushing across uneven stones and brittle grass that bent without sound, and the horse slowed again, not from exhaustion but from focus, its head lowering slightly, nostrils flaring as it drew in the air with deeper, measured breaths, as if reading something written into the land itself. The faint metallic sound came again, clearer now, not loud, not sharp, but steady enough to be real, and this time Ethan heard it too, a soft clink carried on the wind, irregular but deliberate, like something shifting gently against something fixed. He stopped walking, his boots settling into the ground as he listened, the night around them no longer empty but filled with quiet signals he had never noticed before. The horse stepped forward without waiting, the rope tightening once more, guiding him along the narrow curve until the path opened into a shallow clearing tucked between the ridges, and there, half hidden beneath shadow and time, stood the remains of something that did not belong to the open wild, an old structure, barely standing, its frame leaning at an angle as if the years had pressed it slowly toward the earth, the wood darkened and worn, edges softened by weather, and a single length of chain hung from one side, swaying gently in the breeze, catching the faint light with each small movement, creating that quiet metallic echo that had drawn them here. Ethan stepped closer, his breath slowing as the realization settled in. This was not a place someone would stumble upon by accident. It had been left behind, forgotten, yet not entirely erased. The horse moved ahead of him now, the rope slack once more as it approached the structure with a calm certainty, its steps careful but unwavering, and when it reached the edge of the clearing, it stopped, standing still in a way that felt different from before, not searching now, not listening, but recognizing. Ethan followed, the lantern revealing more of the space, the outline of an old post, a broken fence line that had once marked a boundary, and beneath the faint layer of dust and time, something else began to show, marks in the ground, not fresh, not clear, but repeated enough to form a pattern, like hooves that had once circled the same place again and again. He crouched slightly, bringing the light closer, tracing the uneven impressions with his eyes, and then he noticed it, a second mark, carved into the wood of the leaning post, faint but still visible, a symbol, worn by years but not erased, the same shape as the brand on the horse's shoulder. Ethan's chest tightened as the pieces began to align in a way he had not signal. Ethan turned his head, watching as the horse adjusted its stance, placing its weight carefully, and then lowering its head again to the same spot on the ground, this time pressing just a little more firmly, not digging, not scraping, but insisting, repeating the motion with a calm patience that made it impossible to ignore. Ethan crouched beside it, bringing the lantern closer to the earth, the light revealing more than shadow now. There were lines in the dirt, faint but deliberate, not natural cracks, not random impressions, but marks left by something that had been disturbed before, long ago, then covered again by time and dust. His breath slowed as he reached down, brushing the surface gently with his hand, the soil loose in a way that did not match the rest of the clearing, and beneath that top layer, the texture changed, firmer, shaped. He paused, looking once at the horse, and the animal did not move away, it simply watched, its dark eyes steady, reflecting the lantern's glow like something waiting to be uncovered. Ethan pressed his fingers deeper, clearing a small space, enough to reveal the edge of something solid beneath, not stone, not root, something straighter, more deliberate, wood, aged but intact, buried just beneath the surface. His chest tightened slightly, not with fear but with the quiet realization that whatever this place had once been, it had been hidden, not abandoned by accident but covered with intention. He cleared a little more, enough to expose a narrow corner, the shape suggesting a box or a panel, something placed here and left behind. The horse shifted again, stepping back half a pace as if giving him room. Its ears relaxed now, its body no longer pulled toward distance but grounded in the moment, and the air around them felt different, no longer waiting, no longer searching, but holding, as if the land itself had been waiting for this exact moment to surface. Ethan sat back slightly on his heels, his hand resting on the exposed edge, and he understood something simple and undeniable. The horse had not just brought him to a place, it had brought him to a choice, and whatever lay beneath the dirt was not just part of the horse's past, it was something that had the power to change what came next. The night deepened around them, the sky stretching wide and dark above the quiet clearing, and Ethan remained still for a long moment, his hand resting on the edge of the buried wood as if he could feel something through it, something older than the land itself, something that had waited long enough to be found again. The lantern flickered slightly as a faint breeze returned, brushing past his shoulder and stirring the chain into a soft, uneven rhythm. And the horse lifted its head just enough to acknowledge the sound, not startled, not uneasy, but aware, always aware. Ethan drew in a slow breath and began to clear more of the dirt, his movements careful, deliberate, not rushed, because whatever this was, it did not feel like something meant to be uncovered in haste. The soil gave way easily, looser than the surrounding ground, as if it had once been turned by hands rather than wind, and with each small movement, more of the object revealed itself, a wooden lid, reinforced at the corners with metal now dulled by time, the edges worn but still holding shape. It was not large, perhaps 3 feet across, buried shallow enough to be found but deep enough to remain hidden from anyone who was not looking for it. Ethan paused again, sitting back slightly, his eyes shifting toward the horse, and the animal stood quietly beside him, no longer searching, no longer pulling toward the distance, but watching, its presence steady, grounded, as if it had reached the place it was meant to reach. The connection between them felt different now, no longer a question, no longer uncertain, but shared, like 2 parts of the same path finally meeting at the same point. Ethan placed both hands on the lid and pressed gently, testing its weight, and it did not resist. The soil around it loosened enough to allow movement, and with a slow pull, he lifted it just enough to break the seal that had held it in place for years. The sound was soft but distinct, wood shifting against earth, a quiet release that seemed louder in the stillness than it should have been, and when he opened it further, the lantern light reached inside, revealing not emptiness, but purpose. Inside lay objects carefully placed, not scattered, not forgotten, a folded piece of cloth, worn but intact, and beneath it, something that caught the light in a way that made Ethan lean closer. He moved the cloth aside with a cautious hand, revealing a small metal plate, engraved with the same symbol he had seen on the post and on the horse's shoulder, but here it was clearer, preserved, the lines sharp despite the years, and beside it, a set of papers, aged and yellowed, edges curled but still bound together, protected by the way they had been stored. Ethan hesitated before touching them, not out of fear but out of respect for the weight of what they might hold, and the horse shifted again, stepping closer, lowering its head just enough to bring its breath into the space between them, warm against Ethan's hand, steady, reassuring, as if to say that this was not just a discovery, it was something that belonged to both of them. Ethan finally reached in, lifting the papers carefully, the texture fragile but intact, and as he unfolded the first page, the lantern light revealed writing, faded but legible, names, numbers, records that spoke of ownership, lineage, something far beyond what the town had seen when they laughed at the animal beside him. His eyes moved across the lines slowly, the meaning settling in piece by piece. And the realization came not as a shock but as a quiet certainty: the horse he had been given was not worthless, it was not broken beyond repair, it carried a history that had been hidden, deliberately, a past tied to this place, to this mark, to something that had once held value far greater than anyone had believed. And as Ethan looked up from the page, meeting the steady gaze of the horse, he understood that what had been uncovered here was not just truth, it was proof. And whatever came next would not only change how the town saw this animal, it would change everything they thought. They knew. The lantern light trembled slightly as Ethan held the papers closer, his eyes moving more carefully now, not just reading but understanding, each line carrying weight that reached far beyond the quiet clearing, names tied to land, to ownership, to bloodlines that were not ordinary, and there among them, one name repeated with a precision that left no doubt, a ranch once known across counties, long since disappeared from maps and memory, and beside it, markings that matched the brand etched into the horse's shoulder, not a mark of neglect, not a sign of something discarded, but a symbol of lineage, of breeding that had once been protected, valued, even sought after. Ethan's breath slowed as the truth settled deeper. The horse beside him was not just surviving, it had been part of something larger, something that had been hidden on purpose, and the question rose quietly in his mind, not loud, not urgent, but steady: why would something like this be buried? Why would a place like this be erased and left to fade into nothing? The wind returned, soft at first, brushing across the clearing and stirring the chain once more, its faint sound no longer mysterious but almost familiar, like a voice that had finally been heard. The horse shifted closer again, its presence steady and calm, no longer searching, no longer restless, as if its purpose had reached its end, and now it waited, not for the land, not for the past, but for Ethan. He folded the papers carefully, placing them back into the box with a kind of respect that came without thought, then paused, his hand resting briefly on the metal plate, feeling its cool surface, its engraved lines still sharp despite the years, a quiet reminder that truth does not disappear, it only waits. He closed the lid slowly, not sealing it away again, but acknowledging that what had been hidden was no longer lost, and as he stood, the weight of the moment followed him, not heavy in a way that burdened, but in a way that grounded, that gave shape to everything that had come before. The walk back felt different, the same path beneath his boots, the same quiet land stretching out around them, but no longer empty, no longer uncertain. The horse walked beside him without hesitation now, its steps still uneven but carried with a steadiness that had not been there before, and Ethan did not need to guide it, did not need to pull or direct. They moved together, as if the distance between them had been replaced by something shared. By the time the ranch came into view again, the first light of dawn had begun to rise along the horizon, soft and pale, turning the sky into a quiet blend of grey and gold. The barn stood as it had before, the fence lines unchanged, the house still small against the land, but Ethan saw it differently now, not as a place worn down by time, but as a place standing at the edge of something new. He tied the rope loosely once more, the horse lowering its head this time, finally drinking from the bucket that had been left behind, its movements calm, grounded, and Ethan stood there watching, the papers still fresh in his mind, the symbol clear in his memory, and he knew what would come next would not be easy, because truth rarely was, but it would be undeniable. And when the town woke, When the same voices that had laughed gathered again under the same open sky, they would not be looking at the same man, and they would not be looking at the same horse, because some things, once revealed, do not return to what they were before. Morning arrived without announcement, just a slow widening of light across the land, and by the time the town gathered again under the open sky, nothing outward had changed, the same wooden rails, the same dust rising under boots, the same voices filling the air with easy confidence, but Ethan Cole did not stand at the edge this time. He walked forward with a steadiness that did not ask for attention yet drew it anyway. The horse beside him no longer looked like something forgotten, its coat still worn, its steps still carrying that uneven rhythm, but there was a presence now, something quiet and grounded that made people pause before they laughed. Charles Whitmore stood near the center as he had the day before, his posture unchanged, his expression carrying that same polished certainty, but when his eyes settled on Ethan, there was a flicker, small but real, something he could not immediately name. Ethan stopped just short of the circle, not stepping into it, not needing to, and without raising his voice, without demanding silence, he placed the folded papers on the top rail where anyone could see them, the movement simple, deliberate, and it drew attention in a way louder actions never could. The murmurs began first, quiet, uncertain, then spreading as people leaned closer, reading names they had not heard in years, markings that carried weight beyond opinion, and the symbol, clear and undeniable, matching the faded brand on the horse that stood beside him. The shift in the crowd was subtle at first, laughter fading not because it was silenced, but because it no longer fit, and as the realization moved from one person to the next, the space changed, not in noise but in understanding. Whitmore stepped forward then, slower than before, his confidence still present but no longer untouched, his eye scanning the papers, then the horse, then Ethan, and for a moment he said nothing, because there are truths that do not require explanation, only acknowledgement. The horse stood still through it all, its head level, its breath calm. No longer searching, no longer waiting, as if it had already completed its part, and Ethan rested his hand lightly against its neck, not as a claim, not as ownership, but as something quieter, something earned. The wind moved gently through the space, lifting dust that caught the morning light, and in that stillness, something settled that could not be undone, not by words, not by pride, not by what had been believed before. The town did not erupt. It did not cheer, it simply grew quiet in the way people do when something real stands in front of them, something they had missed, something they had judged too quickly, and Whitmore finally stepped back, not defeated, not broken, but changed in a way that showed itself only in the way he no longer spoke. Ethan gathered the papers again, folding them with the same care, and turned without ceremony, without needing to stay, because the truth had already done what it needed to do. The horse moved with him, steady, grounded, no longer pulled by distant hills or unseen calls, and as they walked away from the circle, the space behind them remained still, holding the echo of what had shifted. The ranch would still need work, the land would still demand its due, and nothing about the road ahead would be easy, but something had been restored that could not be measured in acres or money, something quieter, something stronger, and as the sun rose higher, casting long light across the path they followed, it became clear in a way no one could deny. Sometimes the horse they laughed at is the one that carries the truth, and sometimes the man they overlooked is the only one willing to follow it.